Amidst the horrific news of these last days and weeks, uh, we've seen signs of solidarity, general strikes, global marches. In that context, this is a very important, indeed urgent, yet also complex topic we're going to engage today. At any time, especially now, the hope, the goal is to offer what I know will be a smart civil debate on an issue of enduring importance. We view the nation as a big tent, which has over time and to this day and into the future convened civil and smart debates on topics dividing or unresolved on the left. And we see this discussion certainly in that vein. These days, there's lots of talk, sometimes babble, about the liberal rule-based order. But whose order? And increasingly, the concept of rules-based order is advanced as a substitute for international law. Think that the United States is about to convene a summit for democracy. This has been proposed by the Biden administration. So you'll have a new club of power entities with the potential, it seems, to further inflame international tensions, deepen dividing lines, subjugate, perhaps impoverish people. In a world that needs a reimagining of what human security, solidarity, human rights mean. So we need a new internationalism more than ever. And of course, the list of democracies, by the way, is to be determined by the United States. So many people, and many of you are on this call, are trying to grapple with the character of 21st century internationalism, anti-imperialism. Whether it was Zimbabwe, still Syria, Libya, today, more countries. There are debates on the left about whether and how the US left should engage in anything, including but not limited to pressure on our own government. That is an act of solidarity with the movements in those countries. Or is the better course to have a policy of complete non-engagement with the rest of the world? There are lots of alternatives. But I want to conclude by noting that if there's one consistent through line, and Don knows this having written a short history of the nation, it's the powerful belief that military misadventures, imperialism abroad, does not allow true democracy at home. And that is part of the nation's editorial history today, animates us. But what also animates us are civil debates, perhaps heated, passionate debates on the left about such issues as today's. So very grateful that this terrific panel could join Don in a conversation that is so much part of the nation's history and tradition. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Katrina. First of all, thank you for convening us and for opening the nation's big tent. I want to repeat Katrina's view that the nation is a big tent and a place where our commitment is to not just free speech and not just open debate, but civil debate on the left. So I'm assuming we're going to hear some disagreement today. I certainly hope so. That'll keep us all awake and on our toes. But I think, the commitment to civil debate on the left is a very important part of what we do at the nation. And I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second. We have an extremely distinguished panel, and my own role in this panel is basically as just a referee. No biting, no gouging, no below the belt, which I'm sure isn't going to be much needed, and to try and focus the discussion in fruitful directions and to take audience questions and make sure that our audience have a chance to ask their questions and for their questions to be heard and responded to. But I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I'm remembering being part of 1 million people on the streets in London in the anti-Iraq war marches, and both feeling what an incredibly powerful moment that was, and feeling some personal discomfort with some spectrums of the movement, some portions of the movement spectrum that I was marching with, but nonetheless felt that it was very important to be there. So in a sense, in the search for 21st century internationalism, to me, that anti-Iraq war movement represented a kind of a high watermark, and my own role in that was just as a foot soldier, whereas I want to salute Katrina's and the nation's role in being a real lone and courageous voice for opposition to that war, certainly in the US media, where you had a whole array of former leftists joining the ranks of the laptop bombardiers. And, the fact that the nation never did that and indeed stood up in opposition to the war gives us, I hope, a kind of credibility to convene this kind of debate today. The other thing is to tell you a little bit about how we came to be here, and that's because I rejected something. Gilbert Achcar sent me, and Rowan Carey, who has recently resigned from the Nation, was a longtime editor and somebody who was very interested in international affairs, an email asking if we'd publish an open letter on anti-imperialism. And I wrote back and I said, I'm kind of against open letters, basically not because they have no merit, but because the Nation could fill our pages every week with open letters. And, unless I had a blanket policy of saying no, we'd be overwhelmed by them. So I said, no, we weren't going to publish it. But I said, if you wanted to write an article based on the arguments in this open letter, I'd be delighted to publish it because of course I had enormous respect and admiration for Gilbert's work. And so he sent this article, which we published, I'm looking at my screen, on April 6th. It had a title that he hated, How to Avoid the Anti-Imperialism of Fools. I should say for the record that it's the editor who assigns the title, so that was my bad. If you consider it a bad, you certainly shouldn't tax him with that. And then it became clear that there was a lot to say and a lot of quite a wide spectrum of opinion on the left on this issue. And the person who helped me to see that was Bill Fletcher Jr. And from essentially those conversations, we decided we would hold a forum and convene a debate. And then the question was, who else should be on this panel? So I'm now going to introduce the panel, and hopefully you'll see the force and how lucky we are to have these people with us. I'm going to begin with Gilbert, and also to say that the people will be speaking in alphabetical order. So I'm going to introduce them now all together in alphabetical order. And then we'll open the debate with Gilbert, who grew up in Lebanon and is currently professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. His many books include The Clash of Barbarisms, Perilous Power, the Middle East and US Foreign Policy, which he co-authored with Noam Chomsky, The Arabs and the Holocaust, The Arab-Israeli War of Narratives, and The People Want, a radical exploration of the Arab uprising. Nadje Al-Ali is a feminist scholar and activist who has focused on women and gender with reference to the Middle East, particularly Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, and the Kurdish movement. She moved a couple of years ago from London, where she'd lived for 25 years and also taught at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, to take up a position at Brown University, where she's currently director of the Center for Middle East Studies and also Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies. Her wide-ranging books include Iraqi Women, Untold Stories from 1948 to the Present, and What Kind of Liberation? Women in the Occupation of Iraq, co-authored with Nicola Pratt. And her recent publications include Feminist Dilemmas, How to Talk About Gender-Based Violence with Reference to the Middle East, which was in Feminist Review in 2019, and Sexual Violence in Iraq, Challenges for Transnational Feminist Politics, which was in 2018. Phyllis Bennis is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies, where she directs the New Internationalism Project, working on ending US wars and occupations, Palestinian rights, and US domination of the UN. She's written widely on the Middle East and US foreign policy and the movements that oppose US foreign policy. And her books include recent primers on Palestine, Israel, the global war on terror, Afghanistan, and more. She's a co-author of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and the Iraq-era United for Peace and Justice, a co-founder, of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and United for Peace and Justice, and was twice shortlisted to be the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Upon graduating from college, Bill Fletcher Jr. went to work as a welder in a shipyard, thereby entering the labor movement. Over the years, Bill has been active in workplace and community struggles, as well as electoral campaigns. He's worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. Bill is the former president of Trans-Africa Forum and a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies. He's the co-author with Peter Agard of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941, and co-author with Dr. Fernando Gapacin of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and the New Path Towards Social Justice. And he's the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 other myths about unions. However, his most recent book, and I hope we get to hear more about this, is a political murder mystery entitled The Man Who Fell from the Sky. So Gilbert, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin, but I want to read first from the pitch you sent me, and then you can tell me whether you want to depart from that or not, which says, since the end of the Cold War, new imperialist wars emerged in which the US confronted forces in the global South that were much less people-based than the kinds of forces it had confronted during the Cold War, often utterly reactionary forces such as despotic right-wing national regimes or Islamic fundamentalist forces. Cold War anti-imperialist reflexes have become more and more problematic. The enemy of my enemy has become more and more often unworthy of being my friend. So I wondered if that strikes you as a reasonable place to begin, and if not, feel free to begin wherever you like. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Thank you very much. Maybe, if possible, off the time count, but I want to thank the nation. I think I can speak in the name of us all, the four panelists, in thanking the nation for organizing that and inviting us to be part of it, for thanking you, Don, and Peter Rothberg, who organized the panel. I'm very glad to be actually on the same panel with Phyllis, Nadje, and Bill. I would also like to, as a starting point, and I think also I can speak here in the name of at least the four of us, the panelists, in condemning Israel's onslaught, the ongoing onslaught on the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, and inside the Israeli state itself. I mean, this is appalling what's going on. Every one of us has been seeing these appalling images. So I think that is an important statement to make at the beginning of this meeting. And before getting in the thing, I just want to clarify, because you might unwillingly have confirmed a false rumor that I am the author of the open letter. I'm not the author, I'm not even the initiator. I just contributed to gathering signatures for that. And yes, I asked you if you were interested in publishing it. Okay, now, after these precisions, let me make a brief opening statement on the topic of our discussion. I just start from the guidelines, which I tried to define in the short piece that I wrote in the Nation, which has nothing to do with, which is not related to the open letter directly. It's a matter I've been thinking about for very long, and especially over the last 10 years in a whole set of discussions. So these three guidelines, which I believe are necessary guidelines for a progressive democratic anti-imperialism, I'm reading them from my screen here. The first one is about the fact that the reason we oppose imperialism, it is because imperialism tramples over the people's right to self-determination. Our starting point, the value that we start from, is the people's right to self-determination, and that should be the cornerstone upon which we base our positions, not the knee-jerk opposition to anything any imperialist country does. That should be derived from the initial principle that I mentioned. The second point is the fact that anti-imperialism means opposing all imperialist states. Of course, and I'm very sensitive to that, albeit not myself in the United States. Of course, in each country, one must regard its own their own imperialism as their main enemy. But that doesn't mean ignoring the deeds, the terrible deeds that sometimes of other imperialism, like the Russian imperialism, for instance. So anti-imperialism means opposition to all imperialist countries, not just one of them or a few of them. And finally, and I will read my text here, even in the exceptional cases when intervention by an imperialist power benefits an emancipatory popular movement, and even when it is the only option available to save such a movement from bloody suppression, progressive anti-imperialism means advocating complete distrust in the imperialist power and demanding the restriction of its involvement to forms that limit its ability to impose its domination over those that it pretends to be rescuing. What does it mean? It means that in no case and in no circumstances can we be enthusiastic supporters of any imperialist intervention, any intervention by an imperialist country. The principle of total mistrust in imperialist governments is obvious, but that's why even when we believe that an intervention is something that has a progressive effect on a popular movement, we should fight to limit it to for instance, delivery of weapons is different from a direct intervention on the ground. I may be in favor of delivery of weapons in some cases to movements fighting against a much stronger oppressive enemy, but I would be against, for instance, an invasion of any country.
Gilbert, I'm going to stop you there. I'm sure we'll come back.
I finished.
But thank you very much. And thank you for keeping it concise. That was lovely. Nadje, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I actually met Gilbert on a panel on Iraq, and there's lots of overlap, with our views. And at a time when, I felt quite lonely in panels in the context of anti-sanctions movement and anti-war movement, where in Britain, but also US, the left was campaigning, advocating against sanctions, anti-war, but was glossing over the atrocities of the regime of Saddam Hussein. So myself and several other women of Iraqi origin felt very uncomfortable and actually started an organization called Act Together, Women's Action on Iraq. And following the invasion of Iraq, similarly, a situation where many people on the global left, were celebrating the so-called resistance against the US-led occupation. And I remember I was at a big event, the World Tribunal on Iraq in Istanbul in 2005, and everyone for 3 days was cheering, the resistance that at the time was killing innocent Iraqis. And of course, now we know that parts of the resistance contributed to the building of ISIS. But the point that I want to add to the discussion is that as a feminist, who is very much concerned about gender-based violence, I find it very frustrating that often, particularly in the US context, the focus on challenging Islamophobia and challenging racism, and of course we need to do that if we are based in the US or any Western context. But while doing that, I find that some of my colleagues, some of my fellow activists, but mainly academics, spend much time focusing on US imperialism, and again, ignoring, glossing over, or even apologizing regional, national, and local factors that contribute to gender-based violence in the Middle East. right? So in the name of we should not speak about their culture, we should not speak about their religion. And of course, there are lots of stereotypes and there are Orientalist depictions. But what happens in that context is that actually feminist activists and queer activists based in the Middle East do feel undermined by people on the left, whether academics or activists. And I would say that this is specifically strong in the US. And I guess a final point, having recently moved from London to the US, I have to say that one of the things that strikes me most here is the constant US lens. So even in the context of anti-imperialism, just as Gilbert pointed out, everything is read through the lens of the US, and in some ways actually reproducing an imperialism, and also in another way constructing everyone as passive puppets, without agency. And I think that is really problematic, but it's not only problematic on a sort of intellectual level, but it's actually really dangerous on a political level. And it has caused lots of unhappiness, rifts, and tensions with activists in the Middle East. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for thank you for keeping it concise and for nonetheless getting in a lot of provocative thoughts. Phyllis, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Don, and thanks to the nation for all of this. Today is the birthday of both Ho Chi Minh and Malcolm X. So the intersection, I always think about that day of being the intersection of war and racism, which is so much at the core of imperialism and colonialism. And what we see, of course, in Palestine these days is so focused on that. So it's very appropriate that we're meeting on this today. There are lots of questions here, obviously, and I have lots of ideas coming from Gilbert and Nadje. But I think that since the point of our discussion is really about how to build movements, rather than the more abstract questions and definitions, building a movement is much harder now in terms of movements to oppose imperialism and to oppose wars in the 21st century. It's harder than it used to be. It's not to say it was easy in the past, but it was easier to figure out the various sides, partly because the military leadership was part of the same organizations and the same movements in so many of these anti-imperialist struggles of the from the 50s through the 60s and 70s, that it was easier to see in the context of building broad anti-intervention movements, particularly here in the US, but elsewhere as well, but also within those movements, whether it was for Vietnam, Central America, where there was a left core within those movements that actually supported the other side. Didn't mean we have supported everything else, but everything that they did, but we supported their social program. That's what no longer exists. And I think as both Nadje and Gilbert have indicated, it was really in the first Gulf War that we saw the beginnings of that divide, because that happened with the end of the Cold War. And that was not an irrelevant component of why the war actually happened. But I think that when we look at that, one of the things that we see is that there was a divide in the left, which still exists in this country, between those who sort of clung to this sort of Cold War era notion as if there was still a socialist camp, a socialist front, as if the leadership of the resistance movements, whether in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere, were led by progressive left forces, anti-imperialist forces, which of course, in many cases they were not. And that made it much more complicated to build internationalism. It also had to do with what was happening, and I'll speak from the vantage point of working in the US on these movements. It was a time when the imperialist wars abroad stopped being the central component of how people saw their lives and what their government was doing. That was particularly the case after about 2007 and 8, when the economic crisis globally sort of took over, if you will, the sense of centrality of what the crisis of imperialism meant in terms of people's lives all around the world. And in that context, I won't go into all of the impacts on the anti-war movement. They were very, very powerful in a very negative way. But it led to a very different assessment of where internationalism emerges and how that gets shaped. I think, to keep this very brief, I think that we have to look at the need to build internationalism much more urgently, in fact, in this period when what internationalism looks like is much harder. When we don't have socialist-led and progressive institutions that are fighting back against US imperialism militarily as well. There are military challenges and there are progressive forces, women's organizations, trade unions, all the counterparts, if you will, of progressive forces everywhere else, but they're not the same forces. That's not who's doing the fighting. And that makes it much more complicated. It doesn't make it less important, but it does make it less complicated, more complicated. And I would just end with the notion that what gives me some hope in this period is this understanding that we are at a moment of far more intersectionality in this country, and I would say globally, where movements around racial justice, around environmental justice, immigrant rights, all are taking up the link with wars abroad and the need to stop militarism, to stop military spending. The intersection between them has become much more real. So even though we don't have that kind of inherent internationalism that emerges when the progressive movement as a whole is focused on wars abroad, we do have with younger people, with people of color, with these new institutions, new organizations that are springing up within our movements, the potential for a much greater new rise of internationalism. And that gives me some real hope.
Thanks very much, Phyllis. And again, thanks for sticking to the time constraints. Bill, there's a lot here. The intersectionality of racism and imperialism, the distinction these days between anti-imperialist and progressive forces. But I assume you have your own line of approach, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Don. And my thanks to the nation very much, and to the panelists, and particularly to Gilbert for an outstanding essay. So quickly, in the interest of time, one, the 21st century internationalism of the oppressed, I would argue, must begin with a combination of the principles that were laid out by Comrade Achcar in his essay, along with the necessity for a concrete analysis of actual conditions. Contrary to the belief system of too many people, strategy does not exist in the realm of principles alone, but must be grounded in reality, a fact that many of us in the United States have missed over time, myself included. In the 1970s, for example, when I and many other Black leftists were hoodwinked by a group, a national liberation group out of Angola called UNITA, which ultimately ended up playing a disastrous role in Angola. But in the absence of a concrete analysis, we were drawn to general platitudes. Big mistake. So now, what do we mean by internationalism then? And it seems to me that we've got to think concretely when we get beyond resolutions. We need to be thinking about direct action. One can think about the role that English workers played in refusing to unload ships bearing cotton from the Confederacy, US dock workers refusing to unload ships from South Africa, sit-ins at corporations or embassies that engaged in egregious behavior, South African dock workers refusing to unload weapons that were bound for an authoritarian Zimbabwean government. There's also pressure on oppressing governments and corporations. And this means going directly after governments and or corporations that are engaged in heinous activity and where the oppressed in those countries seek international support, a point that Gilbert emphasizes that I think is that we can't afford to lose. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions is one example of the approach. Some of the work currently underway to challenge the military dictatorship in Myanmar is yet another example. The thing about the forces on the ground, in the case of South Africa, for example, it was the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania that called for BDS. But if you go north, for example, to Northern Ireland, where there was the issue of national oppression of the people in the north, the Catholic population, the Sinn Féin was not calling for BDS. They were saying that there was a particular direction that they thought that people around the world should engage in supporting the struggle there for national liberation and unification. And finally, there's a pressure on our own governments, which many of us in the United States are very uncomfortable around unless the US is the clear opponent. And what we have to understand is that we're engaging in a reform struggle in the international arena. We on the left do not occupy political power. We're not running governments, but we are engaged in a reform struggle that is not dissimilar to other reform struggles that we engage in. So one final bring in for a landing. We cannot argue that because the US is the greatest purveyor of violence on this planet, that this means that the US cannot be compelled to do what needs to be done on occasion. The sanctions against South Africa, for example, were forced on the US government rather than a position of neutrality. There was support for UN action in defense of the people of East Timor, led by a capitalist Australia playing that particular role. And it was correct for that intervention. In 1936, leftists around the world insisted that their respective capitalist governments should offer military assistance to the Spanish Republican government, which was under siege by the fascists and the German and Italian allies, despite the fact that those capitalist governments were in many cases leading their own respective empires. It was a concrete analysis of the specific conditions at that time. In general, we should be pushing for multilateral government actions through bodies such as the United Nations. But any involvement, whether multilateral or unilateral, must depend on the positions advanced by the popular movements in the affected countries. And I will leave it there, Don. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Bill. So I've got a lot of topics here. I mean, there's the reliance on and failure of international institutions. There's the tendency on the part of the global left to sometimes take the 10,000-foot view and ignore the reality of violence on the ground, particularly violence against women in affected societies, and the failure to give cognizance of the full autonomy and the full effect of these struggles. There's Phyllis's acknowledgement that the ground has changed a lot, and it's become much harder to build an anti-interventionist left international. And I thought there were two things. And one thing you said, Bill, made me realize why I love your work so much, which is the constant self-criticism. And I thought, you know, at some point I'm going to invite each of the panelists to think about an episode like your episode with UNITA in Angola that has changed, you know, that when you reflect on it, changes how you think about these things today. I thought that was really fruitful. But I want to bring us, to begin with, to the present moment, you know, where Palestinians are being murdered, bombed from the air, denied medical and aid and sustenance, and where, you know, the US's traditional ally, Israel, is the agent of this violence, and where we see, you know, the US vetoing a Security Council resolution. So in terms of the existing international infrastructure, but it's not just the UN and it's not just the US. If you look at how completely ineffectual and paralyzed the EU has been, you know, where there's, in theory, there's no US to play the bad guy there. And yet the EU has been just as ineffectual as the UN. So I wondered, and I'm gonna, I guess, start with you, Gilbert, just because it's been the longest since we've heard from you. If you want to speak to the present moment and its perils, but also perhaps its necessities and opportunities.
With regard to what's going on?
Israel-Palestine, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, Don. I mean, the United States is the main, by far, the main backer of Israel, and the only country on earth that can stop Israel from murdering people. And yet what we have, I mean, people expected that the change from Donald Trump to Biden would mean a change in US policy in some way because of the past tensions that existed between the Obama administration and Israel. And nothing of this materialized, even though there is a much bigger support for Palestine, for the Palestinian people in the United States, even among the Democrats, even in the US Congress. And yet this administration is just basically continuing, even if in different style, but the policy of allowing Israel to commit its murderous attacks without any attempts at stopping them. Now, you could say that, the United States is no better than Israel in that regard, but since Israel depends on the United States very much, this is to be considered as a direct US aggression on the Palestinian people. And therefore, it is absolutely necessary to stop it from where it starts, which is from Washington. And that's here the issue, that the Palestinian people and the balance of forces between the Palestinian people and Israel are crushingly in favor of Israel. And the only way to redress that a little is by the popular movement, by the pressure on the US government in the United States. That's absolutely crucial for the Palestinians.
Phyllis, this is a vineyard you've been in for a long time. Do you?
Yeah, and I actually have just finished a piece, not published yet, on the history of US rejection of ceasefires when Israel is one of the, is the perpetrator. I would just challenge one notion that Obama was significantly different. Obama's rhetoric was very different than that of Trump. The policies that Trump imposed in certain ways were vastly different than every other president in terms of moving the embassy, recognizing settlements, et cetera. But Obama had been consistent with earlier pro-Israel presidents, and Biden is being consistent with Obama. There is this history of refusing to accept a ceasefire, let alone call for a ceasefire. They've never imposed a ceasefire until Israel is ready. And we know that the Israeli policy is based on this notion of what they call mowing the grass in Gaza. It's a racist understanding of the need, as they put it, very openly. These are in official documents of various sorts, to occasionally, usually every 4 to 6 years, this time it was 7 years, we have to go to war against Gaza to teach them a lesson and to make sure that there's no misunderstanding about who has power and who does not. So this is a constant in Israeli policy, and it's a consistent position of the US, both at the United Nations, where they refuse to accept the potential of in this case, it wasn't even a resolution. It was simply a statement that was under discussion by the Security Council to call for a ceasefire. The US refused that, rejected it in 2006 in the war in Lebanon, in 2009, again during Operation Cast Lead, in 2014, again. Each time the Israelis have said, we're not ready for a ceasefire yet. And the US has said, okay, let us know when you're ready and we'll support it. That was Biden's position last night. And I think this is what we're dealing with. The last point I would say is that, again, there is some optimism here. The movement for Palestinian rights, which has done amazing work in challenging and really transforming the public discourse and significantly the media discourse, is now for the first time visibly having an impact on the policy discourse. And we're seeing a big shift in the Democratic Party, where Democratic members of Congress are challenging the Biden administration directly, saying this is not okay. We've never seen that before within the party. And so I think there is some potential here looking forward, as well as the potential because the unity, the new unity of Palestinian forces politically within Gaza, within the West Bank, within Israel proper, and in the diaspora, we haven't seen that before. The challenge in Jerusalem and the attacks on Gaza have brought this new level of unity that has enormous potential for the Palestinian national movement.
Let me ask a question. I don't mean to spoil this wonderful moment of unity on the panel, but I'm wondering, is the U.S. left's response to what appears to be a rare moment of Palestinian unity, is that purchased at the price of ignoring the reality of what Hamas does as a government in power? Nadje, I feel like perhaps you are the person who might want to speak to that.
No, would be my answer, because it is not I don't think, we can compare what is happening on either side. And I strongly, I would strongly oppose that idea of saying, oh, we are glossing over. I think there is still the tendency to do precisely that in the US, to say, oh, but what about Hamas? And not taking into consideration the drastic inequality. But I'd like to make the following observation. I mean, although I've lived here only for 2 years, I've been coming, regularly over the last 20 years. And for a long time, there was this, this PEFP, Progressive Except for Palestine, which was very widespread. And I do feel, widespread amongst the left. And I do feel a shift. And I think that's good. But sometimes I feel that this shift towards the orientation support to Palestine is actually more about the US than Palestine. So again, it's a sort of US centrism, that it's more about maybe challenging, for instance, academic freedom or challenging authoritarianism, but it's not necessarily really making the links. And so I think I welcome the shift in general, but I sometimes worry about this, even in the context of solidarity with Palestine, the US centrism. And just if I can just put in here a small note, because we're actually co-organizing a teach-in on Palestine tomorrow at Brown at 12 p.m. EST, where we have speakers from Palestine who are sharing their experiences of the current situation. And I very much hope that anyone who's interested, I'll put it in the chat, would be able to join us tomorrow.
That's great. So we'll have a link to that in the chat. I'm wondering, Bill, obviously, if you want to address this question, you're welcome to, but otherwise, I was wondering whether we ought to talk about the differences here and some of the, and sort of try and sharpen those. We're all united in being appalled by what's happening in Palestine at the moment, but we're not always united in how we think anti-imperialism should be conceptualized, or indeed what would be at the core of a new 21st century version of it. So feel free to make trouble if you want.
Okay, I'm pretty good at that. So I want to start by saying to Nadje, I'm not quite clear what you mean by US-centric in your last comment about Palestine, because I think it's critically important that we identify what people in the United States can do right now and why it should matter to them about what's going on in Palestine. I'm very involved also in the issue of the Western Sahara. And one of the issues you've got to deal with is, why should anyone give a damn? And while that may not be a relevant question for many people on the left, because they know that's not who's going to be influencing policy. It's regular people that are going to say at some point, just like the English dock workers did in 1863, we're not going to unload the ships, right? Even though it's contrary to our immediate interest, we're not going to unload the ships. So I think that we've got to look at what precisely can motivate people to engage in internationalism, and using and doing that at the same time that we're doing all kinds of political education that accompanies and broadening people's perspective. I think where the US-centric issue, where I would unite with you, is, and with Gilbert, is that there is too much of a tendency in the US for people to look at the US as being the sole puppeteer, and that everything that happens is as a result of the maniacal operations of the US. I even had this debate with someone around Myanmar, who was basically trying to tell me that the main issue there was that the United States was trying to block China. I said, really? Are you serious? But that is consistent with this, with what I would identify as US centrism.
Can I just come back quickly? Yes, Bill, actually, I totally agree. And I also, of course, like Gilbert, think that in the current moment, there has to be a US centrism because of the central role that the US might be able to play. So I actually don't mean it in the current situation, but I've noticed, over the last couple of years that, you know, in context of general discussions about transnational solidarity, Palestine always was sort of number one, while many other struggles were happening. And I couldn't help feeling that it was actually more a cry for help in terms of solidarity within the US. So I'm speaking here Trump, authoritarianism, and what, because Palestine, of course, is the issue that when I challenged, for instance, the panel, they said, well, Palestine is the only issue that's being criminalized. So again, that kind of, to me, just confirmed the view that because it's criminalized in the US, that's, you know, the topic, and it's not so much about making links with Palestine. But I don't think it's an either or, you know, I don't think it's an either or. This is opening up the spaces also for the kind of solidarity and the kind of US centrism that is needed today.
Okay. Phyllis, I saw you shaking your head, so.
Yeah, I agree that it is, this is an important moment, and I'm sorry for the noise outside. I keep turning off my sound because I know it's probably disturbing. I do think that there's a difference, though. I think that Palestine is, there are issues around Western Sahara for sure, and virtually no one in our movement is yet enough familiar with that question, and it's an important question. At the level of how movements understand the world, particularly those who don't define themselves in the anti-war movement, people who are working on racial justice, people involved in immigrant rights, in environmental justice, in all the other questions, the women's movement, the trans rights movements, all the other movements that don't primarily focus on international issues. Palestine is the last remaining traditional settler colonial challenge. And it's made possible by the United States. US centrism here is crucial because it's the United States that is enabling the settler colonial reality of occupation and apartheid in Palestine. So I think that's fabulous. And I must say that I think that the recent shift that you're speaking of, Nadje, which I agree with you. I mean, I've been working in this movement for, well, I hate to say how many years, a very long time. But the difference in the last 2 or 3 years has something to do with Trump, but has more to do with the rise of the movement for Black Lives, which has taken up the question of Palestine, not in a consistent way all the time, and not in a way that necessarily brings in all that's possible. And our movement for Palestinian rights needs to, and I think in these moments can, work much more broadly than we have. It shouldn't be only Black Lives Matter that's taking it up. It should be the NAACP. It's time that they made that shift as well. And I think for the first time, those things are possible in a way that they never have been. So I think this is really a tribute to the work of that movement over 25, 30 years that has managed to change the public discourse and significantly the media discourse. And now, again, it's finally emerging at the policy level. It's not going to be easy. It doesn't go directly from one to the next to the next. But we've never had this option before. It's never been even a possibility. And for the first time, I think that it is. The problem of Europe is a huge problem because as you say, there's no US veto in the EU, but every country except for Hungary voted for a position to at least demand an immediate ceasefire. The US power there is, and it's the same problem the US faces around the Iran nuclear deal. Why wasn't Europe able to just create a separate system to replace US banking, right? It was that US monetary power, US economic power in Europe is so profound that there's just not the value to European capitalist governments to risk antagonizing the US economic system in order to express solidarity with Palestinians or anybody else. So I think that's a much broader problem.
I think, Phyllis, you opened the door to something, which is acknowledging the reality that after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we are in some sense in a unipolar world, or at least we thought we were in a unipolar world. And I wondered, and I'm hoping to spoil the general mood of comity on this panel. I wondered, Gilbert, whether whether what you call in your piece campism, which is essentially dividing the world into, my friends and my enemies and the enemies of my enemies and my friends, whether that might actually be more rational than you give people credit for, given the reality of the reach of the global reach of US power?
Rational it is, but the problem is which rationality. You know, as you said, Don, the title, the fools in the title were added by you, not by me. So it's not a matter of rationality, but what we have today, and that was the point of my piece in The Nation, is not the old Campism, which was defined in relation to the Soviet Union, you know, and the so-called socialist camp. And that was why the term Campism, where it comes from. But what we are facing today is what I call NeoCampism, which is not defined in positive towards towards the friend, and then the enemy of my friend is my enemy, the friend of my friend is my friend, but it is defined negatively towards the enemy, and the enemy is Washington in particular, and therefore you get into this logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend applied to whatever the United States does in some circles. And these are the circles I call neo-campists, who end up, you know, painting in pink or red, whatever sort of reactionary movements and governments, from Russian imperialism to yes, I mean, Nadje was, for instance, mentioning the uncritical stance towards the so-called armed struggle in Iraq, when a big part of it was anti-Shia struggle, more than anti-US actually, because that was Al-Qaeda, and that was animated by a deeply sectarian, in the religious sense, attitude. So the point that's the point here is that's why I was saying, what should be the starting point? Our starting point is not opposition per se to Washington, to whatever Washington does. That's not the starting point. The starting point is support the people's right to self-determination. And through that, I oppose Washington in most cases. And there might be cases where the one intervention, like in the case of the Kurdish movement in Syria, is something that I can't oppose in bloc. I can oppose in its modalities. I'm against the deployment of US troops anywhere, and that includes, of course, Syria. But I'm definitely for support for the Kurdish movement in Syria against against all its enemies. That includes ISIS, of course, but that includes the Syrian regime, the Turkish state, and everybody else.
Nadje, you've written about Syria, so I wondered whether you'd like to speak to that particular example, and particularly the Kurdish example and Rojava.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, actually, I agree with everything that Gilbert said, except I actually do think that there were lots of people on the left who were very critical of the Kurds, and that's, you know, has been one of the big grievances of the Kurds, that they felt let down by the global left in terms of their fight against ISIS, and that because of their you know, desperate plea for support, and it was mainly air support at the situation where, you know, they were about to lose Kobani, and, you know, the kind of course, the irony on the one side, you know, the Kurdish fighters, especially, of course, the female fighters were glorified. They were, you know, presented as this sort of Amazonian women fighting ISIS. But then, you know, the Kurdish movement, when it was asking for military air support, I mean, there were lots of people on the left who were very, well, who were denouncing it. And I think that is exactly, you know, one of the problems that Gilbert mentions. It's the example where the primary position seemed to be to oppose the US and to not be in support of popular movement. I think the problem, and this is where, you know, becomes really problematic for women and gender issues, that sometimes it's not so clear when we speak about, you know, the people want or the popular movement, that is divided as well. And sometimes the popular movement, of course, is anti-woman, it is homophobic, it is, you know, excluding certain minorities. And this is where it becomes tricky. And this is, of course, where international work, I mean, as Bill rightly points out, we really, really need to do our homework very carefully, because there is a danger that we ally with movements that, appear popular, that appear to, present, say all the right things. But then when you really look deep down in it, are detrimental to women, are detrimental to LGBTQ people, or, ethnic and religious minorities. So that's one thing that I would like to stress, this particular demand on us when you do international work, to really, really, do our homework before we ally ourselves.
Yes, sorry, Phyllis, I'll come to you in a second. But I think, the doing our homework is a really important point. And Bill, I'm going to come back to you after Phyllis. I just want to give you a chance to think about it. And then we'll probably go to the audience. But, on Crimea, for example, I guess one question is, how do you do your homework in the face of a pretty well orchestrated international propaganda campaign? So Phyllis, you had something to say first, and then I'm going to go back to Bill, and then we'll open up to the audience.
Thanks. Yeah, this is obviously a really complex set of questions, but I think it comes back to what are our obligations as internationalists. And in the United States, we are talking about building a movement in the United States as well as global movements. I think we also have to look at what US history has been, what the US does. I mean, if we look at one of the areas where I actually disagreed with Gilbert, although I agreed with much of his article, I disagreed with the assessment around Libya, where the United States and the UN got everybody to agree that this was not going to be about regime change. This was, quote, only going to be about protecting civilians. And we knew it would not be that. We knew it, and we said it. I said it on BBC the night of the UN resolution vote. It was so clear. And I said it too. Of course, and we were right. And there were people in Libya who also said, you all probably remember the big sign on the side of the hill that said, please don't, something, I forget the word they used. It was please don't intervene. We can do it ourselves. We know that one of the first claims was that there was about to be a massacre in Benghazi. And it turned out that when the first French planes flew over there, they were attacking a caravan, a military caravan that was leaving the city because they had been driven out from within. They were able to do it themselves. What would have happened without that? We obviously don't know, but we know that what did happen was a disaster. So I think it's not just about doing our homework and picking which side we're going to be on of the multitude of social movements and organizations, but calling for ending the war, not for any side to win. I mean, that was my position around Syria, as in those debates within the movement in this country. I think it was the reason we were not able to build a real movement against militarization support from the United States to the war in Syria was precisely because so many people in this country were so put off by the way the debate was being waged that it made it almost impossible. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be disagreements, I think, between various components of the people who live in a country, in a region, in a city that is under attack or that is threatened or that has been occupied. I mean, we certainly see that within Palestine. It's not only Hamas that is problematic in a host of ways. People have a whole lot of problems with the strategy of the PA, with the diplomatic strategy, with all of these things. So I think that we have to be very clear that it's not just about finding counterparts and saying and agreeing with what they call for because they're on the ground. Other people are on the ground too, saying very different things. And it doesn't tell us what our position should be. I think internationalism, especially for those in the US, it's not an automatic thing. Anything the US says yes, we say no. But it does mean that military intervention by the United States, I would assert, has never helped since World War II. I think that is a reality. And I haven't seen anywhere it's likely to. So I think there are certain things that become principles, if you will, of what internationalism looks like. And for a lot of us, I think that includes opposition to US military interventions.
Bill, do you want to?
Well, yeah, let me jump in. So U.S. military intervention certainly helped the Kurds, Phyllis. And so
yes,
let's just be
I would
real,
say,
right?
okay, that's
Right,
true.
so,
And
right. So, but see, here's a problem. And I don't know whether we have enough time to get into this, Don. I don't know what it means to call for the end of the war, end of war. I mean, I know what it means, right? You put out a statement, which is what we're very good at. We put out a statement saying all parties should pull back. Okay, well, what does that mean practically? What do we do practically? I was in Tunisia when during the Libyan revolution, and I was talking with Tunisian activists. And as opposed to people in the United States, what was amazing is that A, I found no one that was in support of Gaddafi. B, the debate was not whether to support Gaddafi or not, but whether or not to support the bombing, the NATO attack, right? So from the and it relates to something that Nadje was raising, I think, it like from in the context of what was going on, the people on the ground were having a debate that was very different than most of us were having in the United States. And that most of us in the United States were actually framing the Libyan revolution as almost entirely a plot by the United States and France to overthrow Gaddafi and completely eliminating the agency of the Libyan people. That's one of the places we got to stop. We've got to change the framework entirely. In terms of what you were saying about Crimea, Don, I mean, I don't have an easy answer. I really don't. I think that it's just like what I was saying about UNITA. What the mistake that we made, many of us made, was that instead of doing some real research to try to figure out what was actually going on in Angola, we were paying attention primarily to what the Soviets were saying, what the Chinese were saying, what these different political organizations were saying, but not much research on the ground. And being opposed, as I am, to the Russian grabbing of Crimea does not mean that you're supporting fascists in the Ukraine, right? And I think that's one of the things that's so difficult for us in the United States, in the US left, that we seem to think that if you take a stand, in this case, against Russian aggression, that ipso facto, that means that you're supporting Ukrainian fascists. And we've got to move away from this one-dimensional look, and it makes it complicated. But the last time I checked, that's the nature of politics.
Well, I'm going to embrace complexity and take a question from the audience, and I'm going to encourage us to leap right into something complicated, this is from Eric C. And he
John,
asked,
may I reply to Phyllis, who made the wrong points about my position?
oh my goodness, wrong point.
Oh yeah, you
right,
wanted real debate.
You can have a minute to reply to Phyllis's wrong points, but then I'm going to move us on. Go ahead.
Right. Well, the problem is, there's much of discussions based on hearsay, and people don't read others' positions. If Phyllis had read what I said on 19th March 2011, just after the UN resolution, I exactly said that this is a resolution that opens the way to a war of interference in what's going on in Libya. However, what was the point? The point is, and here, Phyllis, the billboard you are mentioning is something that came much later because people were saying, stop interfering, just give us weapons, and so, because NATO was trying to control the insurgency in Libya. But at the time of the UN resolution, you have mass gatherings in the center of Benghazi and big billboards saying intervention, but no troops on the ground. That was the position of the people because they were threatened by a ruthless dictator massing his troops around their city. So the only thing I said was that at that very moment, when they were threatened with this massacre and there was no other way to stop it, I wouldn't be able to go and demonstrate in New York, as some people did, a few dozens, stop no intervention in Libya when the Libyans are demanding that because they are fearing for their lives. And that's the point. That's why Moscow and Beijing, both of them abstained. They did not vote against this resolution, even though they knew exactly what it was about. They had no illusions.
I
So that's, I think the point here, and if we are speaking of US centrism, is I think the worst illustration of that is when people told me, well, you know, it wasn't sure that they were going to be massacred. I mean, to say that from the United States or Britain, oh, it's not sure. That is, hey guys, try it. If you're massacred, too bad, but maybe you won't be. That's not a position that is acceptable.
Okay, I'm going to move us away from the Middle East for a minute to two other places. One is a question from Eric C., which is, how should US anti-imperialists relate to China? And then Mark Ginsburg asks, what about how should US anti-imperialists relate to Venezuela? So please feel free to choose either of both of those examples. Phyllis, I'm going to go to you first, but you know, this is where simple reflexes aren't enough. So I'm grateful for these questions and for our audience for sticking with us. Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, I would say first, I'm not an expert on either US-China or US-Venezuelan relations, but I do a fair amount of work on Venezuela. I have very close friends involved in the Venezuelan left, which, as people probably know, the left in Venezuela is completely divided between those who support Maduro and those who do not. All are agreed on opposition to Guaido and opposition to sanctions. There's a very important, relatively small, but I think quite influential organization called the Citizens Platform for Defense of the Constitution in Venezuela, which have taken a very principled position, in my view, which I really agree with, that focuses on a call. Their international call is urging people to focus on ending the sanctions, ending US embrace of Guaido, and calling for elections, not for supporting Maduro, not for supporting the economic crisis in the country, which has been massively exacerbated by the US sanctions, but has been also made worse by terrible decisions that the government has made. So I think that it comes back to this issue. I forget who raised this before, but it's absolutely right that we have to figure out ways to oppose damaging US policy while not feeling like we have to embrace whoever claims to speak for being anti-imperialist or socialist or whatever they want to call themselves, but are doing tremendous damage. So I think in the case of Venezuela, that's really our position. US sanctions are responsible for the deaths of Venezuelans, as they are in Iran. It doesn't mean that calling for an end to sanctions, whether in Venezuela or Iran, means that we're embracing those governments. We have to separate that out. We no longer have really, I don't think, any governments around the world that we embrace the way we once did in the 60s and 70s. We were probably wrong then to embrace them as we did. But I think that our obligation as internationalists is very much around stopping the US policies that are responsible for massive death and destruction.
If I can just add here, I mean, I think that the example of China is another example where really we are very much challenged to take complex and nuanced positions. So clearly right now, if you're based in the US, we have to challenge anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism that's very real, right? That's a sort of everyday occurrence. I'm thinking about my students and colleagues, but that should not prevent us being critical of Chinese authoritarianism, the repression, of dissidents, the terrible concentration camps that exist in terms of Uyghur Muslim, ethnic Muslim Chinese population. But somehow, as we've, I think we seem to agree on that, somehow there is this problem that I think Bill just articulated it really well. We seem to be falling into the trap. Okay, well, if you're now fighting either, anti-Chinese racism or in the context of my work, Islamophobia and, racializations of Muslims and racism in this country, then, we become apologetic, about dictatorial authoritarian practices. And that's exactly the kind of pattern that we need to break. And here, I think, Gilbert's idea of campism is the one that we need to move away from. And I think that is really, for me, it's key in terms of developing a more effective leftist international movement.
Bill, do you want to?
Yes, no, I agree very much. I think I appreciate what Nadje was just raising about China and the issue of race. And I think at the level of policy, we need to be fighting for a de-escalation, a military de-escalation in East Asia. And that would be critical as an internationalist stance. I think that we have to understand when we're looking at China that for example, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos feel very threatened by China. And so this situation there is very complicated, but it is not one that will be resolved by increasing the strength of the Seventh Fleet in Asia. And so I think we need to take that strong stand. And I agree very much with what Phyllis was raising about Venezuela. I am very disappointed in how things have played out in Venezuela since the death of Hugo Chavez, for whom I had a great deal of respect. And I think very serious mistakes. But the central policy thing that we should be fighting for is for US disengagement, the non-interference on the part of the US. But that also then raises questions about what forms of solidarity can we give to forces on the left in Venezuela that are fighting the good fight. And I think we have to distinguish that from what we ask of the United States government.
You want to speak to that a little bit, Phyllis? No, okay, fine. Then I'll take another question.
Just agreeing with that last point about Venezuela. I think Bill's exactly right.
Well, Gilbert, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that we have here an example of ignoring the people. What about the people in Xinjiang? I mean, this whole discussion is, the United States and China, and that's all. So why don't we take into account what the people there who are oppressed, who are facing this terrible oppression, what they want, what would they want from us? They're activists, I don't know what. I mean, this is a method. That's the problem here. That has been the problem with the Western left, of this ignoring the people on the ground, ignoring the agency of the people on the ground, ever since we moved from the time of Vietnam and all that, which was at a different time, and we all agree on that, and you had different kind of leaderships, and they were taken into account. But nowadays, this NeoCampism, which is defined by opposition to Washington or London and period, that is ignoring what is happening on the ground. So that's the point. I'm not saying that to advocate I'm definitely against the kind of anti-Chinese policies that have been developed in the United States, but it's not that easy to deal with the issue of Xinjiang, given that it is a crime of a huge proportion. I mean, I don't want to make analogies, but it's like saying, if you had the Nazi Germany there, we shouldn't have sanctions because they're oppressing their Jews, because that's not good. And that risks war. We are creating a risk of global or world war in pushing the US government to sanction Germany because it is oppressing the Jews. I mean, look the logic in which you are. I mean, this is an issue that is very much an illustration of the kind of thinking that really we need to have.
Well,
I'm not saying that because I don't have any definite position on this specific issue.
Well, but I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Phyllis, but maybe you'll also want to address this question from Anne Martin, because as the nation's in-house historian, I remember that in 1937, the nation supported an economic boycott of Nazi Germany. In fact, earlier, when there were the first efforts in New York by Samuel Untermyer to get an economic boycott. So Anne Martin, who's in the audience today, asks, she says, it seems that the point of direct action as described by Bill Fletcher is economic pressure that directly affects corporate imperialist interests. And this may be a space for a constructive response on China. If we look at imperialism from an economic rather than a political lens, so that when we're opposing imperialism, we're not saying therefore the US should send in weapons, and we're not, that there are other levers to use. So, what might, looking at it from an economic lens, allow for, and what might it do in terms of overcoming these splits within the left over sometimes the use of military force? Phyllis?
Well, just quickly on I think that Nadje did reference the challenge of dealing with the crisis around facing the Uyghurs in China right now. I mean, that is huge, and it is complicated. How do we motivate a movement to take up the opposition to these threats the US is making towards China militarily, the military moves that are underway in the South China Sea, and the resulting rise in anti-Chinese racism here in the United States, and at the same time criticize the Islamophobia that is at the root of China's treatment of the Uyghurs? That's not easy to do. And I agree, we have to do that. But simply saying that the left in the US, as if it's one unified left, is ignoring the agency of people on the ground, I think is really not the case. I'm not aware of, and I've been talking with some people who do work on China, primarily on China policy, I'm not aware that there is a specific demand from civil society, from organizations, from movements in Xinjiang about what they would see being useful for the United States. And I wouldn't, on one level, expect that very much, because there's not that much coordination or information available on either side. We don't have, at least I think more broadly, most people in this country, myself certainly included, don't have much familiarity with what is that civil society like? What are the movements? What are the organizations? What are the demands other than the broad to stop the repression? So what are we saying that we in the United States, for instance, should urge our government to do, versus what are we saying we will do? And I think it gets very messy, because the fact that people who are desperate will urge, will demand, will cry out for something urgent and desperate, which might include US military support. I don't think any Uyghur organizations are doing so, but in other situations. I understand that, but I also understand what, in my experience, US support leads to. The notion that NATO is trying to control the developments in Libya by giving them arms, that's not a surprise. NATO always does that. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what they were created to do. That's what the US does. So it may be that people on the ground who are desperate because they're being oppressed by their own government would see NATO or the US as somehow different than that. And in our case, we know the US is not different than that. So it doesn't give you the answer. The fact that some people on the ground are demanding something doesn't make it a strategic answer for what social movements, anti-imperialist movements, left movements in the United States or anywhere else should do to recognize and support agency of people on the ground. There's lots of different agents on the ground, and agency means lots of different things. Nationalism has turned from something broad and anti-imperialist into micro-nationalisms that have divided countries among themselves and divided communities in the name of self-determination. Who determines who gets self-determination? Who decides who has agency at any given moment? I think those are really complicated problems. And I don't think there's a theoretical answer that gives us a pattern to follow. I think every situation is different.
Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I can, if you allow me, just to give an illustration to Phyllis. On the same day, I gave my interview to ZNet on Libya, 19th of March, 2011. You had a big rally in Beirut, in my country, by Hezbollah. And as you know, Hezbollah is certainly more anti-US government than anyone here on this panel, because of obvious reasons. And you know what was Hassan Nasrallah's speech about? He blamed the world, the Western countries, for not having intervened before in Libya, for having let Gaddafi repress his people for 1 month before intervening. That was his speech. So you see that people on the ground, in the area, in the region, see differently. And I happen to be one of those people who are from the region and who see through the prism that we have in the region. So when I have a population in a city imploring a whole population in a city, and we saw it live every day on Al Jazeera, in the central square of Benghazi, as we had seen Tahrir Square in Cairo before, the months before. They were, the whole masses imploring the intervention because they were dead afraid of being massacred by Gaddafi. I can't come and tell them because I'm in Washington or whatever, sorry guys, but you know, we can't accept any form of intervention of our government anywhere under any circumstances. That is not internationalism, that is isolationism. That is Pat Buchanan, that is even Donald Trump. That's basically what he tried to portray himself as being, although he is not. It was hypocrisy, but that is not internationalism.
Okay, now you've touched on. So you're very much, thank you. You're very much in sync with our, at least some of our audience, because we had a question which I really want to put to all of the panels, or it was a proposition, and this comes from Tzige Nemariam. And the proposition is quite simple, and you've answered it, so I'm not going to put it to you, which is non-intervention policy is the best foreign policy. So that sounds pretty simple. Phyllis, you're shaking your head no, and Nadje, you're shaking your head no. I'm going to go to Nadje first, and then back to you, Phyllis, and then to Bill. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course, in an ideal world, I mean, I agree with Phyllis. I mean, position against militarism, against war. But as Gilbert rightly points out, I mean, there are situations, and the situation was in Libya, the situation that the Kurds face. There are situations where, I mean, it is not, we are under no delusion that the US is bringing democracy and human rights to a country. We know that, okay? But if it's a matter of people being, you know, slaughtered or having some, you know, chance, you know, especially, you know, okay, another example is actually, I'm thinking about Iraq, the no-fly zone after the invasion of Kuwait, right, which allowed the Kurds in northern Iraq to start to build up a semi-autonomous region. These are not perfect solutions, right? But we are talking about the least worst. We are talking about saving lives, right? And I think it's too easy, it's too lazy to say, and it's very easy for people who are not in those countries, and especially, you know, if you're in Europe or the US, to take that position. And it doesn't mean that we are, you know, buying into the discourse of, you know, empire. We're not. We're critical, and we have to be, you know, we have to be on it. And, you know, when it's happening, we are, you know, we're looking, but we have to look very carefully what is happening. And this is not the end. This is just some kind of strategy to prevent the loss of life. So it's just easy. And I like another example right now, Afghanistan, right? Yes, of course, you know, the invasion of Afghanistan was a disaster. Of course, you know that. But now it's also too easy to say, let's just leave. And every day, almost every day, you know, Afghani girls, women, and innocent people are being killed, right? So I think it's much more complex, and we have to, we can't just, that's such an easy solution to say. It's not, I don't agree with it.
Phyllis?
Well, I didn't say it. I do say that I have not seen anywhere where US military intervention did better. I think there are moments where it might save one group of people for one moment, and the aftermath is always worse. It's always been worse. I mean, we can argue about what the US bombing actually did or didn't do vis-a-vis their bombing up near the in Kobani. They're bombing up near the oil fields at the same time, which is where the actual main part of the bombing went on at that point. It was Kurds themselves who, as from what I was told from various people, were actually the ones who saved the Yazidis when they were stuck up on the mountain. But I think it's also a question of understanding that there are no absolutes here. You know, the no-fly zone that the US established against UN resolutions. One was approved by the UN, the other was not. The US sort of just made the claim, Bush made the claim, Clinton made the claim that they were both UN no-fly zones. led to the deaths of 790 people in the no-fly zones who were killed by bombing in the no-fly zones. Aside from that, they set the stage for the later wars that came in the militarization process that was already underway in Iraq. So I think it's a real question about whether that was a useful thing or not. I don't accept that it was, but I think the sanctions were far more devastating to everybody. The Kurds in their own zone were getting significantly more per capita in terms of money, food, medicine, because of the way the way the sanctions were developed, because the Kurds had the political clout to fight for that. The Iraqi people didn't. So, I mean, in all of these cases, there is huge negative impacts. And I think that saying that because some set of people on the ground are asking for US military intervention, and then the US military intervention happens, that makes it okay. I don't think it does. I think we have to have an independent view too. Being an internationalist, I don't think tells us who on the ground we should listen to. You know, everybody has counterparts on the ground. Everybody can find people who will support what you already think. If that's the way you're going to go, that's backwards. You don't start there. You don't start with what you think and then go ask people who here agrees with me. But the reality is, for people who are trying to figure it out, who are trying to study it, who are trying to have an internationalist approach, there are always people who then emerge saying, yeah, you're right, this is X, not Y. And I just don't see that support for US military intervention makes sense. I do think that the economic question is far more challenging in a certain way, because it always gets portrayed that economic sanctions, for instance, are the alternative to war. They're not. They're a weapon of war. They kill, in general, these days, more people. They are responsible for more deaths than direct US bombing. You know, if we look at Iraq, if we look at Iran now, sanctions have devastated whole populations. If we're talking about broad economic sanctions, if we're talking about targeted sanctions or military sanctions, which is, of course, the ones we should support, refuse to deal militarily with countries, refuse to sell them weapons, refuse to provide military aid, etc. Those are important strategies that we should be demanding of our government. But the other part of being internationalists, I think, is to say that we have obligations as people. What can our movements do to help people that are being oppressed by our government's policies?
Bill, I'm going to ask you to be brief, and we may have one more question after this, and then we're going to close it out. So go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to try. I think that the discussion has moved, unfortunately, too much in the direction of US military intervention. One of the things that I tried to raise in the beginning is that internationalism can operate on different levels. And I want to emphasize that. The second thing is, I'm a Star Trek fan and I believe in the Prime Directive. And it's great on Star Trek, but the problem is, in the real world, as Nadje was pointing out, the question is not whether we believe in non-interference, but what exactly do we mean by non-interference? In other words, when sanctions were slapped on South Africa in 1987, that was interfering with the internal affairs of South Africa. Let's be real, let's stop BSing about it, right? No, there were no US troops on the ground, but we were intervening. In fact, the popular movements here were saying the US should intervene in the internal affairs of South Africa. So the problem is with the idea of non-interference is that it depends on how you define what non-interference is. The final point is in relationship to an earlier question about economics, is that I think that part of what we have to do as progressives is identify when we are trying to push the government to do something, and then when there might be alternative means. For example, economic pressure. Example, when the Dominican Republic's government denaturalized hundreds of thousands of Haitians, resolutions against this were BS. We should have figured out, what do we do about the Dominican government, right? And there's a few things which I'm not going to repeat here, but there's things that people could have done that would have led to the Dominican government all of a sudden discovering democracy. That's internationalism, right? When we're looking at the activities that are going on in Myanmar, it's not about whether US paratroopers should land, in Myanmar, are there things that we can actually do, both to influence US policy, but also to weaken the coup people in Myanmar? And I think that there are people around the world that are looking at that, looking at financial flows, looking at what corporations are involved, looking at trade. Back in 2000, I was involved in a case in South Carolina of these dock workers that had been charged with inciting to riot. And we built a global protest movement. And one of the factors in that global protest movement is that dock workers around the world were contemplating whether they were going to shut down world trade, right? In protest, that's internationalism. So that there's a number of things. So we shouldn't be restricting this discussion to whether there's US fighter planes that are engaged. There are different things that have to be done, but you got to come back to, there's got to be a concrete analysis of actual conditions and guided by the kind of principles that Gilbert wrote in his essay.
Okay, that was terrific. Thank you. I'm gonna try and close on an easy one. So this isn't about US troops on the ground. This is an area where we all agree that something needs to be done and where there's room for, indeed, there's a very well-organized plan, movement calling for economic pressure. What can we do as progressives now internationally as part of a movement vis-a-vis Palestine? And you've each got a minute. So just give me your top priority, and I'm gonna go in reverse. All right, I'll start with you. I was gonna go in reverse order and let you have the last word, but I'll start with you, Gilbert, which means that, Bill, you're gonna have the last word, but you've each only got a minute.
Well, that's an example. I'm fully in favor of sanctions on Israel. I'm fully in favor on BDS, which is about sanctions on Israel. So that shows you that the matter of sanctions is a matter to be discussed, not in general principle, but on the basis of the concrete analysis in each case. And there's a huge difference here. Sanctions on Iraq were murderous sanctions, which had absolutely no relation to any progressive cause whatsoever. They were purely imperialist, murderous sanctions that led to the death of close to 1 million people, according to the mortality rates differences. The sanctions on Iran are also sanctions that has no relation to any progressive cause. And I'll go beyond that to say, I am in support of Iran's right to arm itself with a nuclear weapon as long as Israel is fully armed with nuclear weapons. So my position would be for a nuclear-free Middle East, but certainly not for a one-sided unilateral right for Israel to wear nuclear weapons, which is presently the case, and which is what the United States is trying to implement.
Okay,
final point, just a final point. The Libyan movement did not ask the United States to
No,
They asked the United Nations.
I'm afraid I'm going to cut you off.
And that came through a decision of the United Nations. It's a big difference, very big difference.
Nadje, on to you.
Yeah, if we're in agreement that being based in the US, the aim has to be to influence US policy, because that is so key to finding a solution. Then I guess the different things. So as someone who works in education, I feel that it is my responsibility to try to facilitate spaces where Palestinian voices being heard, and also voices of Israelis and others who are engaging in a critical analysis and providing, good strategy. Secondly, I'm also in agreement that to support BDS and to decriminalize, those who are advocating for BDS. And then finally, I think it is important again to be in touch in relation with Palestinians on the ground. And for myself, it means mainly Palestinian feminists who are obviously challenging, resisting Israel, but are also critical of the PA and Hamas.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Phyllis.
Yeah, this is an incredible moment around Palestine. And I would just say that while BDS remains very important, the education stuff is crucially important. Changing the discourse remains crucial. And right now there are some key congressional tasks that need to be supported, I would say, by everyone. One is the Resolution 2590 by Congresswoman Betty McCollum that would impose end-use restrictions on military aid. It's a first step towards cutting and ending the $3.8 billion a year in military aid. The other is a new resolution that was just dropped this morning, or is going to be dropped tomorrow, I guess, led by AOC and Mark Pocan and others, that is just a very narrow, specific call, disagreeing with the Biden administration's effort to sell $735 million worth of new missiles to Israel right now, this week. That's going to go in tomorrow, and I would hope that people will urge their own members of Congress to sign it. So that's the urgence.
And finally, Bill?
Yeah, quickly. First is a clarification, because since this is being recorded, the things I was saying about the Dominican Republic, my recommendations, which I didn't want to go into, were completely nonviolent. I want to just make that clear. In terms of Israel and Palestine, I agree with the other speakers. Support for BDS. I think we need to raise hell in the Democratic Party. And I'm really excited about what's going on. But the other thing, which in some ways may be an extension from what Phyllis is raising, is one form of internationalism is a profound ideological struggle against Zionism and Christian Zionism that I think we need to take up here. And we have to understand particularly the depth of Christian Zionism and the way that that has an impact on other parts of US politics. And so I think that's going to be a critical element in our internationalist work.
Thank you. Okay, listen, this has been a terrific discussion, as lively as I hoped, and perhaps more civil than I'd imagined. So I want to thank Peter Rothberg and Ilana at The Nation, and Sarah Burke for getting us all here, keeping us all going, and fielding your questions, and Gia Del Prado from The Nation for being the unseen but essential technical backstop to this whole thing. Thank you very much, Gia. And thanks to Gilbert Achcar for getting this moving, and for Nadje Al-Ali for consenting to come and being such an essential participant in this discussion, and Phyllis Bennis for, as always, being forthright and clear, and Bill Fletcher for encouraging us to take this risk and convene this space and have this discussion. It's been tremendously useful for me. One of the audience members said, well, I guess it's complicated. And yes, it is complicated. And, you know, I'm sorry if you came hoping for easy answers, but that's not what we do here at The Nation. We try and parse out all the strands of difficulty and make sure that all of the participants get to be heard. So if you like what you heard, come back to us. You can visit us at www.thenation.com. If you really like what you heard, you could subscribe or donate. And thanks as always to Katrina and Aaron O'Mara, The Nation's president, for making our work possible. And thank you all for bearing with us so long. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks.
and if you like this, next Wednesday, there's another one, oh my gosh, I've forgotten who that's with, so I feel very, with Daniel Ellsberg, yeah, him, with Daniel Ellsberg. And that'll be with Daniel Ellsberg and Katrina, and a week after that, it'll be myself in conversation with Wally Shawn about making space for art. So we try to cater to all tastes here on The Nation, or at least all progressive tastes. Anyway, thank you very much. Take care.